There were always two kinds of dreams. Most dreams would bend reality, and the laws of nature could easily be broken. In these dreams, Quilyn could float around without a single wing beat. It was here he was free to use any cryption he wanted. These were the naturally gifted abilities, where dragons could use extraordinary powers that some could only call magic. Other times, he could take on the form of any other dragon entirely. It was these dreams that he loved the most, where he could be anyone and do anything, escaping from his home of paradise, where he could imagine life far away as a normal dragon. Occasionally, Quilyn would slip into the second kind of dream, where he felt most vulnerable. These dreams mirrored reality with frightening accuracy. They let him see every detail of his home and beyond paradise's stone walls, even beyond the sky, where the stars turned into eyes, staring right back at him. They made him feel insignificant and small, judging his very presence, instilling a sickening paranoia that would creep into his mind the further that he reached. And when he would wake, he could barely stand. Tonight was one of those nights, as Quilyn dreamed of passing through the stone walls of his room, past the gate entrance where he drifted weightlessly into a tree. He imagined catching one of the branches. Of course, in these dreams, he couldn't physically touch any of the trees, but he could feel their essence of life within their roots. He thought of himself lazily lying on his back, on a curved branch, looking up at the sky, where instead of the stars were the eyes that blinked back at him. Some stared at him with malice, and others of curiosity. And still there were eyes so large that they filled the entire sky, and yet they were always staring at him. Two teal eyes blinked at him in the darkness, taking the form of a tall, lanky dragon, completely shrouded in shadow, descending from the sky. Quilyn frowned. Every time a dream like this happened, this dragon would always show up and would never leave him alone. "Out here again, are we?" the shadow spoke. Quilyn said nothing, trying to ignore the shadow, avoiding its curious glare. "May I sit with you?" the shadow asked, teal eyes blinking slowly. "I would like to be alone. My mind is full enough," Quilyn said with agitation. He folded his wings closer to him in an attempt to warm himself, which of course did nothing in this dream. "Let me in. I can help. I've waited long enough for us to talk," the shadow said encouragingly. Quillen's ears flicked back immediately, hating how invasive the shadow always seemed to be. Something always felt off. Why were these eyes out of the entire sky the only ones to speak with him? Why were they the only eyes to take the form of a dragon or anything at all? For that, Quilyn couldn't figure out, and so he was always hesitant to entertain the shadow. "I don't want to talk. I would much rather enjoy my dreams," Quilyn said sharply, rolling his eyes before jumping out of the tree and back towards the safe looming walls of paradise, where he stopped before the open gates. The shadow followed. Quilyn looked back at the shadow with searching eyes. "You're the only one I ever see here," he said, feeling alone amongst the thousands of empty, soulless eyes. He nervously traced the crevices of the stone walls with a claw, averting their poisonous gaze. "I'm not even sure I can trust you," he said quietly. The shadow didn't look angry or upset, only curious and thoughtful, tilting its ghastly head. "Well, trust cannot be built upon a foundation of uncertainty. I fail to see how my concern for your well-being has not been deserving of this consideration. So, where will our trust begin?" it asked firmly. Quilyn pressed his back into the wooden doors of the gate and faced the shadow, slumping down tiredly and looking deep into the endless abyss that was the shadow's body. Its features were too dark to make out any detail except for its eyes. "How can I start to trust you? You're just a part of my dream," Quilyn said pointedly, finding himself cornered, again, by this mysterious being who had already spent hours talking to him in previous dreams. The shadow appeared to contemplate his question. "I am very real, and I hope that someday we shall meet. Let's start with common questions." The shadow tried its best to act lighthearted, but an awkward smile, where its mouth was only darkness, only made the gesture creepy. "I'll let you ask first. Something simple, such as, what food are you most excited to eat?" the shadow suggested. Quilyn used the tips of his wings to poke nervously at one of the gate's rungs. Already it seemed he had given too much of himself to the shadow. "Only one," he said slowly, not fully trusting in his decision. But which question should he ask? There were too many to choose, and what did shadows eat anyway? "Well, what is your favorite food?" Quilyn asked the shadow.
Yellow-belly crab,
It replied.
any sort of preparation. It is delicious.
He didn't know what to expect with such a deliberate response. For all he knew, the shadow could be out to eat him. At times, it would stare at him with an insatiable hunger. However, he had heard of yellow-belly crab, but it was very rarely served and difficult to prepare.
What about your favorite food?
The shadow asked. I really like Sylvain Royale. Sweet, with a smoky, savory glaze is how I like it, Quilyn said, thinking of the tender meat and juicy pine root, which made his mouth water.
A fine delicacy,
the shadow agreed, and sat closer to Quilyn with softer teal eyes, in another attempt to try to pry into Quillen's mind.
I know how troubling it must be without your own extraordinary abilities. I wish there were some way I could help.
Quillen's frills flared up with rage.
I told you, I didn't want to talk about it.
And with that, Quilyn pulled hard on the rungs of the gate, shutting out the shadow with a clash, before the shadow could say another word. The intruding daylight was what finally woke Quilyn. He stirred in his blanketed hammock, tiredly crawling to the rug below. He did not at all feel rested, and his legs wobbled as he struggled to pull himself up. He had nearly slept into the afternoon, and the household remained silent. The servants must already be out of the house, and his family would have already left for the market. He'd have thought he was alone, weren't it for the warm smell of venison coming from the dining hall. Quilyn yawned and tucked his wings through his white and gold pelerine. His parents must have left him a servant to prepare him a meal, and he expected to be scolded later for not waking up on time and wasting valuable labor on himself. The dining hall, however, was completely empty. The three-tiered tabletops of the fine polished granite were already clean and had on them the typical sapphire decorations the servants placed there between meals. The gemstones looked like the eyes of the shadow in his dream, watching his every move, and Quilyn hurried past them. The warm smell unmistakably came from the nearby kitchen, so Quilyn poked his nose through the doorway to peek inside. He was surprised not to see a servant, but the stunning orange and gold wings of his father preparing and searing steaks of smoked-tail venison and juicy pine root on the giant flat cooking stone that stood against the far wall of the room. It was uncommon for the lord of the household to prepare meals, but Quillen's father enjoyed it and occasionally dismissed his servants early. "Well, I'll be. He lives," he said enthusiastically to Quilyn, grabbing another log from the pile and throwing it into the furnace beneath the cooking stone. He fanned the furnace with his feathered wing to stoke the raging fire. "Should I also prepare you breakfast before I serve you lunch?" Quilyn draped himself, with his wings outstretched onto the lower wooden preparation tables in the center of the room in exhaustion. "If you're offering," he grinned, his nostrils flaring, taking in the sweet and savory scent in the air. "Ha!" his father grunted, unamused, pushing a stack of plates and bowls onto the table Quilyn had occupied, shoving the stack into Quillen's nose. "Off the table, you know better. Come help me with the glaze, you lazy lump." Quilyn groaned and slipped off the table and over to the furnace. "You know I'm not good at this. I thought this is why we have servants," he complained, as his father set the kettle of glaze down on the top of the coals with his claws. "That is why you practice. Stir it until it's thick enough to coat the spoon. I raised you to be proper, not lazy. Can't have everything handed to you on a silver dish." Quilyn flicked out his tongue dismissively. Usually, things were just given to Quilyn on a silver dish, and sometimes a gold one. Still, he tried to stir the glaze as best he could. It was much more of a chore for him than his father, since he was an entirely different species. Instead of having a set of slender arms and feathered wings, Quilyn only had his wings like the wyverns had. Only he was much longer and had his own set of flowing long whiskers along with webbed frills on his cheeks and down his back. He struggled to stir the glaze with his wing fingers instead of the dexterous 5-digit claws of a celestial dragon like his father. It was slow, clumsy work, nothing like his father's effortless grace. The silence stretched, almost uncomfortably, until finally Quilyn broke it. "I had that terrible dream again," he murmured, carefully lifting the spoon to check the glaze. The words felt flimsy, barely skimming the surface of the dream's vastness. The endless, watchful eyes and the shadow that appeared every time. The shadow was something he never spoke of to anyone. He couldn't tell if it was a threat to overcome or a presence he was meant to understand. But either way, it felt like a struggle meant only for him. "The one with the sky full of eyes. It's hard to sleep and it feels like I'm being watched," he continued. And he slouched while stirring the glaze, looking into the kettle with a hint of pain in his expression. "Sky full of eyes," his father repeated. His gaze drifted momentarily, as if turning the phrase over in his mind. His ears perked forward, thinking it through carefully, narrowing his eyes as if trying to see through Quilyn's words. Yet his voice and posture remained steady, almost too controlled. I see. He seemed to weigh his response before continuing. But is it the dream that's keeping you awake? Or... He trailed off, letting the question linger, flicking his long brown whiskers in thought. Are you still feeling troubled about yesterday? Another moment passed, and Quilyn didn't want to respond. He felt like he was always being watched and analyzed. It was as if no one could ever be satisfied with him. And when he finally had the courage to face the council, to show them that he was a worthy citizen of paradise and an asset to the Order, they rejected him, dismissing his results as inconclusive and no other explanation. His father disrupted his thoughts. It's not your fault, Quill. The council doesn't understand how to handle hybrids. This will all be settled, and you'll soon get your chance to participate in the proving grounds. Trust me. It's not that, Quilyn sighed. I don't care what the council says. Why couldn't I have been born a celestial dragon? I'd have found my Kryptos, and I'd have a pendant by now, probably harnessing lightning like Fallon, or commanding the rain like you. The spoon slipped from Quilyn's grasp, sinking like a rock to the bottom of the glaze with a small, muffled clink. It took everything in him not to send that kettle flying across the room. His father wrapped a wing around him. The soft, warm feathers offered comfort which Quilyn unwillingly accepted. You are exactly where you should be. You belong in paradise, and you don't need any special powers or a pendant, or even the council to prove that. Quilyn didn't fully believe him, but his father always had a way of making things work out. Even when his parents failed to have hatchlings of their own, his father was still there to comfort and support his mother, bringing in 2 hatchlings with no parents of their own to call family. Regardless, it didn't change the fact that Quilyn was a hybrid, which seemed to create an ever-growing tension in paradise, and it weighed heavily on him. Neither of them immediately noticed at first that a servant had come into the kitchen in a hurry. Lord Jonathan, I apologize, but it's urgent, Burr announced, who Quilyn recognized as their master servant. Burr was a smaller dragon to Quilyn, having no wings at all and a speckled gray and black color, though as for most drakes, Burr was rather large. Go on then. Quilyn's father finished plating the venison topped with the pine root on 2 different plates. Burr continued. Emperor Valdralen is seeking an audience here at the Drakir household. His advisors are already here making preparations. The light sizzling of the stone and the pleasant air turned into stale, silent unease. A shiver ran down Quilyn's back, remembering only a few years prior the only time he had seen the Emperor. He wondered if this was the settlement for getting Quilyn back into the proving grounds. Or perhaps the Emperor would simply exile him, or worse. He looked to his father, whose own brown feathers seemed to ruffle and stand up from his back. There was a long pause before Jonalyn spoke. Well then, invite them in. I'll help with the arrangements. He took the kettle from Quilyn and poured the glaze over the perfectly seared pine root and venison, the spoon falling out onto one of the plates. He finished topping it with Celero leaves before setting the plates on the table, a home-prepared meal of Sylvan Royale. Quilyn thought for a moment of how he told the Shadow of his favorite food, and the irony of being served it first thing in the day. Yes, Lord, Burr said promptly. I have arranged a full staff to your command. Jonalyn nodded. Very good. There is no sense in keeping them waiting. Quill, you eat and go get ready. Burr, would you be so kind as to send for the family to return immediately? His father commanded in a more deliberate tone, moving swiftly and elegantly to follow Burr. And make it quick, he added, gesturing to Quilyn with a snap of his claws before taking a deep, anxious breath and disappearing through the doorway. It is done, said Burr, who started following Jonalyn out, but paused for a second to acknowledge Quilyn with a hopeful nod. Good day, young master. Quilyn nodded back and asked in a hushed tone, Have you heard anything about why the Emperor has come? Burr blinked thoughtfully and sighed. Not for certain, but the talk is Emperor Valdralen is outraged. Though, I wouldn't trouble yourself, it's only talk. I do apologize, I have nothing more. Burr frowned and promptly dismissed himself. The room was still once more, and Quilyn sat alone and abandoned in the cold kitchen with 2 full plates and only his shadow, the darkening silhouette on the wall, to share it with.